The deserts of the American West are remembered not only for the burning sun and the winds that carry dust across endless miles of barren land. They are remembered for something else, something harder to capture yet more haunting: the stories that were never written into the history books, but remained etched in the memory of those who lived, fought, and died on this unforgiving frontier. The West has long been portrayed as an age of gunfire, where law was decided by whoever drew faster. But if one listens closely behind the gun smoke and the legend, there are echoes subtle lingering. The worn-out boots left behind in a broken-down saloon. A name carved hurriedly into the rotting wood of a church beam. The silent gaze of a woman watching her husband ride away, knowing he might never return. In the 19th century, as white settlers drove their wagons westward, chasing dreams of freedom, and land tragedies took root alongside their hope. Encounters with native tribes turned into wars. Small towns rose overnight along the railroads. Drifters carried pistols on their hips, carving out a living with their hands, and too often with their blood. But behind that canvas of expansion and violence lies another realm of memory, one where not only heroes and outlaws lived, but also the forgotten, the nameless, those whose lives dissolved into whispers. Some say that on desert nights, when the wind shakes the wooden signs above abandoned streets, you can almost hear fragments of their stories, of the man who fell defending his town against bandits, of the native girl torn from her people, of the outlaw who died alone, haunted by the weight of regret. These are not tales preserved in history lessons. They are ghosts, fragments of humanity adrift in the desert, hovering between legend and memory. Tonight we follow one such story, a fragment small enough to be overlooked yet powerful enough to illuminate an entire era. They first saw him at dusk, when the sun bled across the horizon and the desert stretched wide like an ocean of fire. He was a lone rider, hunched low in his saddle, the silhouette of a man who had traveled too far without rest. His horse limped, leaving uneven prints in the sand, and the man himself seemed no steadier. The people of the town, no more than 50 souls, clustered around a saloon, a blacksmith's forge, and a single church, watched him in silence. Out here, strangers were never just strangers. A new face might bring trade or trouble. Sometimes, both. He didn't wear the look of an outlaw, at least not the kind they had learned to fear. His revolver sat holstered, worn but polished, and the dust on his coat told of long miles rather than quick violence. Yet there was something else, something in the way he dismounted, slowly leaning on the reins as though they were the only thing holding him upright. His eyes scanned the town, not with suspicion, but with the weariness of someone who had seen too much. "Evening," the blacksmith muttered, breaking the silence. The man nodded once, as if words were too heavy to carry. He asked only for water for his horse first, then for himself. There was no name given that night. In the West, names came later, after a man had proven what kind of shadow he cast. For now, he was only a stranger beneath the ridge, a figure carried in by the wind, stirring the dust of a town that had almost forgotten what it felt like to expect anything at all. And yet in the weeks that followed, his presence would become the thread binding together stories. The town had buried stories of lost betrayal and of violence that refused to die quietly in the desert. His silence was not emptiness, but weight. And in the silence of that stranger, the town began to hear echoes of its own forgotten ghosts. The saloon was where stories lived and where lies often became indistinguishable from truth. By the time the stranger had been in town for 3 nights, his shadow had already stretched across every table, every glass of whiskey, every hushed voice in the corner. They said he came from the south, from a borderland where lawmen had been buried beneath the dust of their own failed courage. Others swore he had once ridden with a band of outlaws, that his silence was not born from grief, but from blood. And then there were those who claimed to have seen his face somewhere before etched on a wanted poster nailed to a courthouse door in another county. But the bartender, a man who had poured whiskey for too many broken souls to count, didn't believe in stories told by half-drunk men. He studied the stranger quietly, noting the way he handled his glass, always slow, deliberate, never more than 2 fingers of liquor. The way his eyes lingered on the piano in the corner, not on the women who leaned against the bar. And the way he stepped outside at sunset, as if searching for something in the desert that only he could see. One evening, when the piano struck up a melancholy tune, and the gamblers cursed their luck, the stranger spoke not to the room, but to no one in particular. His voice was rough, like a blade dulled by use. "They don't bury the dead out here," he said, eyes fixed on nothing. "The desert keeps them, holds their stories, whether we want it or not." The saloon grew quiet at those words. It was the kind of truth men avoided, the kind that gnawed at them when the whiskey wore off. And though no one pressed him further, the room knew this man had walked close with death, perhaps closer than any of them dared imagine. Whispers spread like smoke after that night. The stranger was no longer just a man passing through. He had become a mirror, forcing each soul in that town to see the shadows they themselves carried. By the 4th week, the stranger was no longer a mystery to ignore. He had settled into a rhythm, quiet mornings by the trough, afternoons spent fixing odd jobs no one else bothered with, and nights in the saloon where he drank less than he listened. But in a place as small as this town, time itself seemed to conspire against secrets. It was old man Cawley who first recognized him. The grizzled rancher, blind in one eye and half-deaf in the other, froze when he heard the stranger's voice drifting across the street. His gnarled hand tightened on his cane, and for a moment he muttered something no one else caught. Later that night, he told the blacksmith in a low growl, "I've heard that voice before, near Santa Fe, when blood was running thicker than the river." The blacksmith dismissed it as drunken talk, but the word spread faster than prairie fire. By dawn, the town was buzzing. Men at the general store spoke in half-whispers. Women at the well lowered their voices when he walked past. Suspicion in the West was as deadly as any bullet once it took root. It grew wild. That evening, when the stranger stepped into the saloon, the piano faltered mid-note. He felt the silence but said nothing, only moved to his usual spot near the far wall. Yet eyes followed him sharp as rifle sights. A gambler spat tobacco and muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Ghosts always find their way back. Ain't no ridin' far enough." The stranger lifted his glass slowly, his face unreadable. For a heartbeat, the room hung heavy as if every man was waiting for a gun to be drawn. But nothing came, only the sound of boots creaking across the warped wooden floor as he set the glass down and walked outside into the desert night. Out there, beneath a sky littered with stars, the wind rose and carried the scent of sage. The stranger stood still, listening, as though the desert itself whispered the past back to him. Perhaps old man Cawley was right. Perhaps the ridge had not delivered a mere drifter into their midst, but the return of something long buried, something the town had hoped to forget. And in the West, forgetting was always dangerous. The desert has its way of carrying news farther than any rider. By the end of that month, word had reached ears it was never meant to. A drifter passing through swore he recognized the stranger, not as a nameless wanderer, but as a man once tied to the Red Rock standoff, a skirmish that had painted the borderlands in blood nearly a decade earlier. Red Rock. The very name still made men swallow hard. It was the kind of story whispered at campfires where a dozen ranchers and 24 lawmen had been cut down in a single day. No one ever agreed on who fired first. Some said it was the settlers, others the natives, still others, the bandits caught in between. But everyone agreed the ridge near Red Rock was cursed, and those who walked away never walked away whole. So when the drifter's word spread, suspicion grew teeth. And those teeth soon found a name, Ellie Moran. That was the name carried on the wind-spoken with a mix of fear and recognition. If true, it meant the stranger had not only seen Red Rock, but had stood at its heart. Then came the rider. He arrived at dusk, when the air smelled of rain, though no clouds had gathered. His horse was black as a storm, and his coat bore the scars of hard travel. The saloon doors swung wide as he entered his eyes, searching until they found the figure in the corner, the quiet man the town had begun to call the ghost. "Well, I'll be the rider," said his voice roughened by miles. "Didn't think I'd ever lay eyes on you again, Eli." The room stiffened. Every card game froze, every drink hung midair. The stranger, Eli, if that name was true, lifted his gaze slowly, not with surprise, but with the weariness of a man who had been expecting this. "You've come a long way," he answered. His words carried no joy, no relief, only the weight of an old reckoning. The rider's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Dead like ours doesn't fade with distance. Desert remembers." A silence fell heavier than gunsmoke. Men shifted hands toward their belts. Women glanced to the door. They all knew whatever history bound these two men together, it wasn't finished. And in the West, unfinished debts were always paid in lead or in blood. The name Red Rock had not been spoken aloud in that saloon for years, maybe ever. Yet the moment it left the rider's mouth, the walls seemed to shrink, and every man felt as though the desert itself had pressed its ear against the door. Eli, if that was truly who he was, did not rise. He sat still, his back to the wall, the weight of memory pressing down heavier than the revolver at his side. The rider's presence was no accident. Men like him didn't cross hundreds of miles for whiskey and small talk. He had come for something owed. "Red Rock," the rider said again, rolling the word slow like a gambler testing dice in his palm. "You remember how it ended, Eli? How the canyon burned red, and the river choked on bodies. You walked away from that. Some of us didn't." A murmur rippled through the room. Old Man Colley lowered his gaze to his boots, as if afraid memory might call his name too. The bartender polished a glass already clean, trying to steady his hands. For the younger folk, Red Rock was only rumor. For the older, it was a scar that never healed. Eli's eyes lifted at last. He looked at the rider, not with anger, but with something closer to resignation. "I remember," he said. every scream, every face, and I remember that none of us walked away whole. The rider's jaw clenched. You remember wrong. You walked away free. The rest of us paid. There was movement at the tables, men adjusting chairs, shifting boots, leaning hands near gun holsters. The West was no place for history lessons. When blood debts surfaced, they were settled in the moment. But Eli did not move. His silence weighed heavier than gunfire. Then, in a voice so low it seemed meant only for the rider, he said, "The desert keeps its ghosts. Don't ask me to carry yours." For a moment, the rider stood frozen, his face unreadable. Then he laughed, a hard, broken sound that scraped across the room. "Oh, Eli, you don't get to choose. Ghosts don't follow you because you invite them. They follow because they're owed." The saloon door creaked as a gust of desert wind pushed through scattering cards from an empty table. Men exchanged glances, women gathered their skirts. Everyone knew this was no longer a stranger's burden. The town itself had been pulled into the long shadow of Red Rock, and the desert patient as ever waited for its due. In the days that followed, the town was no longer the same. What had once been a place of weary, routine horses tied at the trough church bells, calling the faithful children, darting between weathered porches, now pulsed with a tension that clung to every breath. The rider, his name finally spoken as Jonas Hale, did not leave after that night in the saloon. He stabled his black horse and took a room above the mercantile, as though planting himself in the very soil of the town. Folks whispered that wherever Jonas stayed, trouble followed. Some claimed he'd been a hired gun, once others said he had been left for dead at Red Rock and had clawed his way back. Whatever the truth, his eyes carried a fire that told no man he'd come merely to talk. Eli remained as he always had, quiet, steady, keeping to his corner of the saloon, or the small room behind the blacksmith shop where he slept. He did not explain himself, did not answer the questions whispered behind his back. But silence in the West was dangerous. To some it meant guilt, to others dignity. To most it meant nothing at all, only the promise that when words ran out, bullets would speak. Soon the town began to fracture. The gamblers and drifters gravitated toward Jonas, drawn to the heat of his anger, the certainty of his conviction. Men like him made sense to them, simple, sharp, and predictable as the snap of a revolver. The older settlers, the families who had buried too many in this soil, watched Eli instead. They saw in him not a killer, but a man carrying a weight they all recognized, one too heavy for words. It was the preacher's wife, a stern woman named Clara, who spoke aloud what others only thought: blood debts don't stay between two men. They spill into the ground. And when the ground drinks enough, none of us walk away clean. Her words echoed, unsettling even the children who played in the dust. For they, too, could feel it. The town was no longer theirs, but a stage built on sand, waiting for history to repeat itself. And somewhere beyond the ridge, where the desert yawned wide and merciless carrion birds had begun to circle, as if they too sensed the old debt was ready to be paid. The confrontation didn't begin with pistols. It began with words, sharp and brittle as dry branches snapping underfoot. It was a Sunday morning when Jonas Hale walked into the church. His boots echoed across the wooden floor, scattering whispers among the pews. Families stiffened, mothers drew their children close, but Jonas seemed not to notice. He carried no Bible, only the weight of his presence. When the preacher faltered mid-sermon, Jonas spoke from the back. "Tell them, preacher. Tell them how men like Eli leave ghosts behind them. How blood spills and then dries, but the ground never forgets." All eyes turned to Eli, seated near the door. He hadn't meant to come that morning. He seldom entered places built for salvation, but Clara, the preacher's wife, had pressed him, whispering that even ghosts might need grace. Now her words felt heavy, almost cruel. Eli rose slowly. His frame carried no menace, but his silence pressed harder than any weapon. He met Jonas's gaze across the rows of uneasy townsfolk. "I've carried that day longer than you know," Eli said, his voice low but steady. "Carried it until I forgot what my own hands looked like clean. But if you think vengeance will bring back the men lost at Red Rock, then you've let the desert fool you." Jonas's lip curled. "You speak of burden, but you wear it like a badge. You left us there, Eli. You left us in the dust, and you rode on." A murmur swelled through the church. Some nodded with Jonas, others looked at Eli with doubt, their faith wavering. The preacher raised his hands to quiet the storm, but the words had already drawn lines sharper than any blade. Outside, the church bell tolled in the wind hollow and endless. When the service ended, men left in silence, their boots heavy, their faces darker than the clouds gathering on the horizon. The fault lines had split. The town was no longer neutral, and every man, woman, and child felt the desert drawing its breath, waiting for the first crack of thunder or the first crack of a gun. It came, as it always did in the West, without warning. 3 days after the church confrontation, the town's main street lay heavy in the afternoon heat. Dust shimmered in the air, the kind of heat that made men meaner, quicker to anger. Jonas Hale stood outside the mercantile, his black horse tethered nearby. Eli was across the street, tightening the saddle on his worn bay mare. A silence stretched between them, taut as a rope about to snap. The townsfolk scattered to doorways, peeking through cracks in the shutters, for everyone knew the signs. The desert had been holding its breath too long. "Won't be long now," Jonas said, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. "Ghosts are ready to be set free." Eli did not answer. He finished pulling the strap, then turned slow, deliberate, his eyes calm but unyielding. For a heartbeat, it seemed the world held still. Even the wind had gone quiet. Then a shot cracked, not from either of them, but from the saloon porch. A gambler, drunk and eager to see blood, had fired his pistol into the air, laughing. But laughter in such moments was tinder on dry grass. Jonas drew first, his revolver flashing silver in the sun. The gambler staggered, a bullet tearing through his chest before his grin even faded. Women screamed, horses reared, men ducked for cover. The street erupted into chaos. Eli hadn't moved. His hand hovered near his holster, but his gun remained sheathed. He stepped slowly toward Jonas, who still held the smoking pistol. The townsfolk watched, breaths trapped in their throats. "That wasn't your debt to pay," Eli said, voice steady. Jonas's eyes burned. "Every man who stands in my way is part of it. You'll see." Before more could be said, the sheriff, an aging man worn thin by years of dust and compromise, burst from his office, rifle raised. "Enough," he barked, though his voice cracked under the weight of futility. "This town won't bleed for your ghosts." But even he knew it was a lie. The first gun had fired. The ground had tasted blood. And in the desert, blood never dried it, only called for more. After the first gunshot, nothing in the town was the same. The gambler was buried hastily on the edge of the cemetery, his grave marked with a crooked wooden cross. No one spoke long over him. Men like him lived and died in shadows. But his blood had cracked the silence wide open, and the town could no longer pretend it wasn't standing on the edge of something greater, darker. By the week's end, the division was plain. Jonas Hale gathered men around him, restless cowhands drifters, with too much whiskey in their veins, gamblers who trusted the certainty of his anger more than the murk of Eli's silence. They saw Jonas as the hand of justice, a man who wouldn't hesitate, who would finish what history had started. Eli, on the other hand, drew the quiet loyalty of the older folk, those who had buried children under this hard soil, those who knew vengeance never returned what was lost. They saw in him a man shaped by regret, a man unwilling to draw unless forced, but who, if forced, would not miss. The sheriff tried to straddle the line, but his authority had always been paper thin, and now it was little more than smoke in the wind. He called a meeting in the church, his voice pleading for calm. "This ain't our fight," he said. "Let the past bury itself." But the townsfolk knew better. The past never buried itself in the west. It stayed above ground, circling like the vultures that haunted the ridge. At the meeting's end, Clara, the preacher's wife, spoke words that lingered long after. It doesn't matter if you stand with Eli or with Jonas. When two men carry a wound like this, it isn't only theirs. The land itself will bleed. Outside, the night pressed close. Men walked home with hands near their belts, women drew curtains tight, and children whispered about the ghosts of Red Rock, as if they might appear at the window. The town was no longer whole. It was a mirror cracked down the middle, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the crack split wide and the desert drank again. Jonas Hale was never a patient man. By the second week after the gambler's burial, he had grown restless, prowling the streets with the simmering heat of a storm trapped in human skin. The town watched him with wary eyes, children darting into alleys when his boots struck the dirt, women lowering their voices as he passed. His presence had become less a man and more a shadow stretching over every home. On a Friday evening, as the last light drained from the desert sky, Jonas strode into the saloon. The piano fell silent, cards lay flat on the table, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. He stepped onto the center floor, turned slowly, and let his voice roll through the room like a drumbeat. "I'm done waiting," he said. "This town can't straddle the line any longer. Eli Morin faces me under the sun before this week is out, or I'll bring the fight to every doorstep that hides him." A murmur rippled sharp as the hiss of a snake. Men glanced to the sheriff, but he looked away, his jaw clenched tight. The sheriff's silence told the truth. The town had already felt he could no longer hold the reins. Eli rose from his corner. His chair scraped against the wood and the room stiffened. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't posture or boast. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried across the room like a bell tolling in a canyon. "You think Red Rock left me whole? It didn't. It tore me open, same as you. But ghosts don't rest when you feed them more blood. They only grow. If you want me, I'll stand, but you'll find no victory in the dust." Jonas's eyes narrowed, his hand brushing the iron at his hip. Then it settled. High noon. 3 days. And this town will finally see which of us walks with ghosts and which of us puts them down. The crowd broke into uneasy fragments, men muttering, women pale, the air thick with fear. Outside, the desert wind carried grit against the shutters, whispering of storms yet to come. 3 days. That was all the time the town had left to hope, to pray, to choose sides. The line was drawn. And in the West, when a line was drawn, it was crossed in blood. The 3 days that followed were heavier than any storm cloud. Time itself seemed to drag its boots through the dust every hour, thick with dread. The town moved as though under a curse shop's half-open shutters, nailed tighter laughter gone from the streets. Men gathered in low voices, some sharpening knives, others cleaning rifles they swore were only for protection. Women filled basins with water, their hands trembling as if even the simplest tasks were tainted by fear. Children, once wild in the alleys, now played in silence, whispering about the shootout as if it were some kind of legend unfolding before their eyes. The sheriff tried once more to intervene. He walked the main street, stopping at doorways, urging men to put down their guns and leave vengeance to the desert. But his words fell flat. The town had already chosen its story, Jonas on one side, Eli on the other. Neutrality had died with the gambler. Eli spent those days not in the saloon, but at the blacksmith's yard. He helped mend a wagon wheel, hammered nails into a fence, carried water for the horses. It was not the work that mattered, but the motion. With each swing of the hammer, he drowned the memory of red rock, the cries, the gunfire, the smell of smoke and blood that had clung to him for a decade. But at night, when the town slept uneasily, Eli lay awake. He thought of the men he had lost, of the moments he had survived, not because of skill, but because fate had chosen to spare him. Survivors did not carry triumph, only questions. Why me? Why then? Why still alive? On the second night, Clara, the preacher's wife, found him sitting by the trough. She placed a lantern at his feet and said quietly, "You cannot run from ghosts, Eli. But neither can you kill them. You must stand not for vengeance, but for the living who still have a chance at peace." Eli met her gaze, his face lined by weariness. "Peace," he whispered. "I don't know if I've ever seen it." She did not argue, only pressed his shoulder gently and walked away. The lantern burned low beside him, casting shadows long and thin like figures from the past, stretching across the sand. By the dawn of the third day, the town no longer asked if the duel would happen, only how many graves would follow it. The morning sun rose harsh and unforgiving, burning the last trace of cool from the desert air. By noon, the streets of the town lay empty, save for the figures pressed against windows, crouched in doorways, or peering nervously from behind half-drawn curtains. No one wanted to stand in the open, but no one could look away. The church bell struck once, twice its tolls echoing against the ridge like the counting of a clock running out. Jonas Hale stepped first into the street. His black coat swung at his sides, revolver heavy on his hip spurs, ringing sharp against the silence. His eyes burned with a fire that seemed older than himself, a fury carved into his bones at Red Rock and carried ever since. Eli came from the opposite end, calm as the slow turning of the earth. His hat brim shadowed his face, his coat dust worn his revolver resting quiet in its holster. Every step he took stirred the dust, as if even the ground knew the weight of what was about to come. They stopped 10 paces apart. The desert wind chose that moment to rise, carrying grit that stung the eyes of those watching. For a heartbeat, the world was still. No bird called, no horse whinnied. Even the children who whispered in alleys seemed to forget how to breathe. Jonas's hand hovered. "This ends today," he growled. "Red Rock buried my brothers, but it left you standing. I'll see to it the desert makes that right." Eli's eyes lifted. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the dust like a prayer ghost. "Don't ask for more blood, Jonas. Men do." The words hung fragile as glass. Then came the silence before thunder, before lightning, before the first gunshot. 2 men, 1 street. The desert waiting hungry. High noon had come. The silence broke with the twitch of a hand. Jonas moved first, his revolver flashing in the sun, a burst of thunder, splitting the noon air. The shot ripped across the street, striking wood and sending splinters flying. Before the echo had faded, Eli's gun was out smooth, measured faster than the eye could follow. His bullet tore through Jonas's shoulder, spinning him back, crimson blooming against the black of his coat. The crowd gasped, a single sound swallowed by the desert's vastness. Children clung to their mothers, men pressed harder against doorframes, every soul waiting for the end. Jonas staggered, but he did not fall. He straightened with a snarl, his teeth bared like a wounded wolf. Blood ran down his arm, dripping into the dust, but his hand steadied. He raised the revolver again, fire burning in eyes that knew nothing but vengeance. Eli stood still, breathing slow, revolver aimed but not trembling. His face carried no triumph, only the weary calm of a man who had stood in this place too many times before. The second volley erupted, 2 shots so close they seemed like one. Dust leapt into the air, sunlight fractured by the smoke curling between them. When it cleared, Jonas was on his knees. His revolver clattered to the ground, his breath ragged, his body leaning against the weight of a world that had finally crushed him. Eli lowered his gun, but did not move closer. His voice came quiet, heavy as the desert wind. "It was never Red Rock that killed us, Jonas. It was what we carried afterward. That's what's been burying us all these years." Jonas looked up, his face pale, blood staining the dust at his knees. For the first time, his eyes held no fury, only the hollow recognition of a truth too long denied. His lips moved, shaping words no one could hear, and then his body sagged, folding into the ground that had waited for him. The street was still again. Only the ringing in the ears of those who had watched remained, the echo of violence that would never fade. Above the carrion, birds circled lower, as if the desert had received its due. Eli stood alone in the silence, a survivor once more, not victorious, not free, only alive. When the last echo of gunfire faded, the town remained frozen. Curtains quivered, shutters, half-open, eyes wide with the weight of what they had seen. For a moment, it felt as if the world itself had stopped holding its breath, unwilling to disturb the dust that still hung in the air. Then came the sound of boots, slow, deliberate. The sheriff stepped into the street, his rifle lowered, his face lined with defeat. He looked at Jonas's body sprawled in the dirt, and then at Eli, who stood unmoving, revolver lowered but still in hand. "God help us," the sheriff whispered. It was not a prayer, only a truth spoken aloud. One by one, townsfolk emerged. The preacher crossed himself. Clara, his wife, held her lantern high, even in daylight, as if the street had fallen into darkness. Children peeked from behind skirts, their eyes wide with the kind of memory that would follow them into old age. Ellie holstered his gun. His steps were heavy as he turned away from the body in the dust. He felt no triumph, no relief, only the same hollow ache that had followed him from Red Rock to every ridge since. Another man gone. Another ghost added to the desert's collection. Jonas was buried at sundown. The preacher's words were thin against the wind, lost in the rustle of sagebrush. Few spoke over the grave. Even in death, Jonas carried a fire that unsettled those who watched the earth close over him. That night, the saloon was quiet. No piano played, no cards shuffled. Men sat in silence, staring at the stranger who had spilled blood in their street, and yet still sat among them. Ellie drank nothing. He only stared into the lantern's glow, as though searching for faces long lost in its flicker. A boy no older than 12 approached timidly. "Mister," he said, voice trembling, "does it ever end the ghosts?" Eli looked at him for a long time. His answer came slow, rough, as sand carried on the wind, "No. But sometimes they stop following when you stop running." The boy nodded, though he could not yet understand. He walked away, leaving Eli alone with the silence. Outside, the desert stretched endless, patient. The ridge loomed against the stars, keeping its vigil. The town slept uneasily, but the land, timeless, indifferent, held the truth as it always had. Men passed, but the desert kept their stories. And Eli once more remained. Not the hero, not the villain, only the survivor walking in the shadow of ghosts. By the week's end, Ellie Morin was gone. No one saw him ride out. No one knew which direction his horse had taken, north toward the high plains, west into the red mesas, or south into the borderlands, where memory bled into rumor. All that remained was the imprint of hoofprints in the dust, already softening beneath the desert wind. The town did not speak of him openly. They patched bullet holes in the saloon walls, swept the blood from the street, and tried to bury the memory as they had buried Jonas Hale. But silence has its own voice, and soon it became clear they could not forget. Children whispered his name as though conjuring a ghost. Drifters carried the story further down the trail, reshaping it with every retelling. Some swore Eli had killed Jonas with one shot clean to the heart. Others said he spared him, and Jonas bled out by his own stubbornness. A few claimed neither man had truly died, that both walked the desert, still shadows locked in eternal pursuit. The preacher called it judgment. Clara called it burden, and the sheriff, when whiskey loosened his tongue, called it nothing but survival. Yet in each version, one truth remained: Eli had come, and Eli had left, and the town had been changed forever. In time, they began to call him not by his name, but by something else, the ghost beneath the ridge. A figure who arrived with silence, carried the weight of the dead, and vanished as suddenly as he appeared. And perhaps that was fitting. For the desert does not keep men whole, it keeps their echoes. It keeps the fragments, the unfinished debts, the whispered warnings carried on the wind. On certain nights, when the moon rides high and the wind scrapes low across the sage, some swear they still see him, a lone rider against the horizon, a man shaped by shadows, burdened by memory. Not hero, not villain, only the survivor, The ghost the desert could never bury. The story of Eli Morin was never written in any ledger or carved into stone. It lived only in the dust, in the broken timbers of an old saloon, in the whispers of a town that learned what it meant to carry ghosts. Perhaps that is the truest form of history in the West, not the records left in courthouses, nor the proclamations nailed to wooden posts, but the fragile testimonies passed from mouth to ear, reshaped by memory, carried like embers from one campfire to the next. What remains certain is this: men like Eli did not vanish when they rode out of town. They lingered not in flesh, but in the silence they left behind. The desert remembers what men wish to forget. The wind will carry it, the earth will keep it, and the ghosts will walk as long as there is dust to cling to their names. And so the ridge stands casting its long shadow across the desert floor. Some call it cursed, some sacred, others only a place like any other. But to those who have heard the story, it will always be more. It will always be the place where two men stood at high noon, where vengeance met silence, and where a survivor rode away into legend. Eli Morin, a name now, half remembered, half invented, a man both real and not real, an echo. The ghost beneath the ridge. And perhaps that is enough. For in the West, where time swallows all the stories that linger, are the only proof that any of us were ever here.